Okay, yes, welcome to my talk, Liberation, Not Replication, or Automation to Support Testing, Not Replace It. So I'm going to be talking about not so much about sort of how to implement automation, I guess. It's more of a sort of, I want to share my mindset, how I think about the value of automation and how that mindset informs how I sort of choose my approaches and my strategies. So for those who don't know me, I'm Mark Winteringham. I've been a tester for sort of over 10 years, and most of that has been revolving around test automation. I teach, coach, mentor around automation in testing, which is what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today for you. Also API testing as well. So if you're interested in those sort of things, want to learn more about it, I do blog about quite a lot of this on my site, mwtestconsultancy.co.uk. I'm also on Twitter, on LinkedIn as well. If you want to just have a chat and ask me some questions but feel a bit shy about putting your hand up, come grab me later. I'm here till tomorrow morning, and the voice is an indicator that I do love to talk about testing. So, first of all, I want to sort of ask a question about what is the purpose of test automation. Before I actually sort of go into that, I want to sort of, if people could put their hands up, who works here, who works with automation in terms of programming, tools and automation, or actually does strategies? Cool, so we're all going to be sort of a little bit comfortable with this then. So I was asking myself, what is the purpose of test automation? And I was going to do a Q&A sort of bit here, but then I realized that was going to take too long, so I'm just going to talk for you all and grab some definitions that I picked up off the internet. So a quick Google of what is the purpose of test automation revealed 4 interesting quotes I picked up. The first one from Wikipedia: in software testing, test automation is the use of special software to control the execution of tests and the comparison of actual outcomes with predicted outcomes. Another one from Software Testing class: automation testing is an automatic technique where the tester writes scripts on their own, I think by own, and uses suitable software to test the software. It's basically an automation process of a manual process. Then from Guru99, manual testing is performed by a human sitting in front of a computer, carefully executing the test steps. Automation testing means using an automation tool to execute your test case suite. And my personal favorite, which comes from an official Microsoft developer blog: test automation is simply an automatic way of doing what testers were doing before. The gauntlet has been put down. So what is interesting about a lot of those topics, a lot of those definitions, is it's very much focusing on the idea that automation can replace what we do as testers. Now, I'm not going to start getting into the whole testing versus automation thing, because I feel personally automation is a powerful tool to use. But it certainly isn't something that can replace me. My personal definition is automation in testing is a means to augment my testing. And now this is kind of a work in progress, so I would love to hear what people feel about this at the end. But what this gives me is a mindset, an attitude, a way of thinking about how automation sits within my testing craft. And it gives it me in a few different ways. First of all, it enables me to be critical of my tools. It makes me want to question them and understand what their value is and what their value is not. So for example, we've got 2 screenshots here of the same site. One's got the CSS and JavaScript turned off, and the other one's all nice and lovely looking. Now, if I was to use something like Selenium WebDriver, I've got like a little script or a framework or an architecture running, and it's going through all these different pages, pushing buttons, and then it gets to the page that it's interested in, and then I pull down some elements and I do an assert on those elements. Both of those pages would pass in Selenium WebDriver. Now, that's not because there's a failing in the tool. It's because the WebDriver is designed to manipulate the DOM and interact with it so that we can move through our sites through a user interface. It is not a visual testing tool. There are other tools available for that. So knowing the strength of my tools and the weaknesses of my tools allows me to be selective. when I need to choose a tool. And I also have to be mindful of the fact that when I select a tool, when I use a tool, it biases me, it influences me. So there's this constant feedback loop going on between myself and the tools that I choose. There's a saying that some of you might have heard before, which is that if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, which is known as the law of instruments. If we're too focused, we're too sold on a specific tool, and we're not critical of what it is, then we end up maybe over-egging it, overestimating its value and its use. And this is where, again, you end up in this issue where you feel that these tools could replicate what you do as testers. So this sort of loop comes from a phrase, we shape our tools and afterwards our tools shape us, by Marshall McLuhan. Now, anybody here who studied media at any point? Okay, a few. You probably have heard of Marshall McLuhan, and the few people that I've mentioned him to other people when I'm going through these slides have all rolled their eyes a little bit when they're like, oh God, you're talking about him. So I was introduced to him a couple of months ago from Michael Bolton, and I really like the ideas and things that Marshall McLuhan was talking about, and how we can apply those sort of attitudes towards our tools. So for those of you who don't know who he is, Marshall McLuhan was a Canadian professor of media. And he was very popular, I think, in the 70s and the 80s. Not sort of as well known now. But what McLuhan was talking about was he was talking about that a media is essentially an extension of us. So things like television, phones, radio, the internet, language are all extensions of us. We're trying to sort of manipulate change around us. So if I follow the mindset that automation in testing is a means to augment my testing, all my tools are a media. All of these things that I'm using are extensions of me because I'm in control. I'm the one that's doing the testing, and I'm using these tools to either help me jump a little bit faster in certain aspects or retrieve more information that I couldn't get in a sort of more sort of keyboard and mouse capacity. So these tools are a media. And what that means is we can look at McLuhan's laws of media and apply them to our tools to be critical of our tools. Now, we've got 4 different things here. I don't want to call it a quadrant, but I might have to. No matter how many times I've tried to sort of train myself not to say it. But the 4 different aspects of this is that we can basically ask ourselves 4 different questions about our media. So let me give an example of one. I have an API testing tool that is data-driven, so it's constantly sending loads and loads and loads and loads of different HTTP requests with different values. So how does this enhance me? How does this enhance my testing? Well, it's allowing me to test quite rapidly data-driven ideas, test ideas. And then at the bottom right, what does it obsolesce? What does it render sort of less important to me, or like makes it sort of kind of push it into the sort of background? And this might be, before I was using this tool, I was doing this in a sort of keyboard and mouse capacity, so I might have been using Bug Magnet or Perl Clip. So these tools then get sort of pushed to the background because I don't feel I need to use them anymore because I've got my API data-driven tool. And what does it retrieve for me? Well, it retrieves me lots of different types of information about what's going on inside my web service or my web API. So I'm gaining new information that I probably couldn't get if I was using the keyboard and mouse. I might find new bugs that were never discovered before. And reversal, what happens if I use this tool too much? I might end up creating so much test data and so much information from it that it becomes overwhelming and it takes me hours to pick through the data. It might be that I have to spend ages fixing my tools. That's no longer augmenting my testing, that is debilitating my testing. So I have to be wary about my tools and using something like this as a model, and it is a model, so it is fallible and it's flawed, but I like it as an idea to sort of question my tools. And then, like, specifically looking at the enhanced side of things. when I was sort of discussing this with Michael, he made a point. He said to me that tools enhance us, but they don't just enhance us for good, they can enhance us for bad. So, as an example, when I got into test automation, I'd been a tester for about 2 years, maybe a little bit less, and I was very dissatisfied with what I was doing. I was very unhappy, I was bored, I didn't feel very challenged. So I sort of thought, well, I'm going to get into automation, and also I want to make some more money. And I imagine a few of you probably identify with that and did the same thing. So I took upon myself to sort of start learning about automation. And I slowly, over time, learned more about tooling and more about automation, because it wasn't something I just picked up overnight. But the problem was I was doing this all within the sort of context of my understanding of what testing is, or what testing was at that point. So all I was doing was I was automating bad testing. I was a bad tester before that, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. But I was automating bad testing when I started moving into using the tools. It was only when I sort of started discovering things like heuristics, oracles, exploratory testing, questioning, collaboration, communication, all these different things, these rich, nuanced things that we do as testers, that I started understanding more about what I do as a tester and more where I could sort of choose target points, key points of what I'm doing in my testing activities to choose tools to help support me. So this is my second aspect of my mindset. I have to be critical of what I do as a tester. I have to evaluate, the details of what I'm doing, because I can think about ways in which I could use tools to support me in that way. I have been all these different types of roles. I still don't know what a QA automation specialist is. I don't really understand why, because I learned some extra tools and could program in a language, that made me special. I mean, I liked it. The money was good. But it didn't really mean anything. And, automation QA, again, this sort of idea of replication is reflected in the titles that we have. So now I like to think of myself as a toolsmith, and I imagine this has probably been sort of bandied around and mentioned a bit over the last few days. This idea that I am a tester, but then I can switch out of my testing context and become a toolsmith. So as a tester, I can be critical, analyze what I am doing, think about it in detail, and then say, hang on, that activity that I'm doing, I could maybe use some tooling to support me with that. So then I switch to my toolset mindset, my toolsmith mindset, and then I can look at creating tools. Now, not everyone is a programmer, not everyone is an automator. So my advice is find someone who is a toolsmith or potentially a toolsmith in your team and strike up a conversation with them. Bring them a cookie or something like that and bargain with them to get you to set up some tools for you. So we have to be, if we're following that sort of replication approach, very much when testing is talked about, it's very much of the attitude that a test is this big sort of abstract thing. It's sort of that person over there, that tester over there, he presses buttons on that machine. So therefore, that must be what testers do. So let's automate that. So then you end up with these sort of full stack, end-to-end based tests that we all have, the sort of familiar problems that we have with, because we're not being critical about what we're doing. So I'll look at what I do. When I'm exploratory testing, I'm creating data, I'm manipulating state, I'm getting the application into a certain state before I run a test or execute a test. Then I retrieve some information, I will make some observations on that, and I'll say if it's a bug or share the information with others. And each of these different little sort of activities that I do as a tester, I can think, well, that part could be automated, that data part could be automated. Some of the reporting stuff is a bit boring when I have to fill in Jira for the umpteenth time today. I could automate some of that sort of stuff. It's just little things. It's not about automating everything I do, just those little things to make me a little bit faster and increase sort of my sort of influence. Oh, I like that, influence. It makes me sound evil. Over my product and enables my testing. And it also means that I can look at things and go, well, like, so the asserting stuff, the actual deciding whether something is a problem or not, whether something is a bug, whether it's something I should highlight, that's hard to automate. So I'll probably just leave that, and I'll be responsible for that. I'm still in the center, I'm still using tools to augment me. So let me give you an example of this. I want to talk about the guitar manufacturing industry. So for those like don't know, I am also a guitarist and a musician in my spare time, and this is my baby. I love this guitar. It's a PRS S2 standard. Yeah, I know, I don't have children. This is the closest I can get. This is my PRS S2 standard. It was built in Maryland, Washington in the USA, and I love this guitar. And I invested quite a bit of money in getting this guitar. And one of the reasons why I wanted it was because of the guitar neck. The guitar neck is fantastic. It's really nice to play with. It handles really well. It stays in tune. It doesn't warp. It's it's glossy but doesn't stick on your hand. You know, all these different sort of boring guitar things that guitarists say. It's got low action. But the big thing about this guitar was that the reason why I was sort of quite interested in it, not just as a sort of instrument to play, but why I think it's interesting in terms of the context of this talk, is that I was doing some sort of research, sort of market research, just finding out about different types of guitars that I was interested in buying. And for this one, I came across a video in which they were going through the manufacturing process of this guitar, how it was being built. And the CEO was talking specifically around when they were building the guitar necks. Now, and he said, always let a machine do what a machine is good at, and never get a person to try and do that, and never try to get a machine to do something a person has to do. Now, let's ignore the sentence structure. The intent, I think, is very interesting. What happened in this video was they would have these sort of long, thin blocks of wood that were sort of kind of rectangular. And they would put that in a machine, like an automated machine that would mill it and just cut it down to a rough approximation of the neck that's required. Now, because these necks and these bodies as well are made of wood, they are subject to changes in heat, in humidity, and they affect how the wood expands and shrinks and warps. So once they got to a rough approximation, they would give that to a master craftsman who would spend time just shaving little pieces off and then leaving it to one side. And then coming back again the next day, shaving a little bit more, until it would fit perfectly snug in the body, so they could glue it in and put the fretboard on top. They were using automation. They'd been critical of the activities they'd done and used automation for the sort of parts of what they were going to do, like certain parts of what they were going to do, because they were like, if we have a machine to do the rough approximation, that frees up our craftsmen to create more of these necks. And they are still of a high quality. So we need to think about, in our testing, how we could do something similar. So the final thing is this mindset allows me to think about how I'm going to strategize. If I'm critical of what I do, and if I'm critical of my tools, I can identify problems. I can think about testing activities. I can think about risks that I'm interested in finding out information about. I can identify a problem, and then I can think about the tools afterwards. So rather than just diving in and using a tool just because some popular team uses it, or rather than just using a tool because I've seen 12 job specs that say you should use it, think about what your context is. What is your problem that you're trying to solve? Then choose your tool. How am I looking for time? 15 minutes? Okay, cool. So, I want to give you sort of 3 examples of how this would work. Now, before, like in the sort of abstract, I was going to talk about a taxonomy of problems. And I found that actually that was quite difficult to do in the end. It started off with a sort of taxonomy of tools and how all these there's all these different tools that work in different ways. And I found that kind of was missing context. I showed it to people and they were like, well, why do I want to use this? Like, I don't care about this. So I tried to define it as problems, sort of a taxonomy of different problems that could lead to tools. But then that became messy as well because some tools fit in certain areas. So what I'm showing you here is kind of how my mindset works. So for example, I'm in a situation where I think we all are as testers, is the product is large, and I cannot observe every change. So I'm critical of that. I ask myself, well, what do I mean by that? What is the actual sort of physical problem that is there? Like, I know that I need to check some stuff, or I don't know what I need to check. I'm concerned that there is a risk over here that I think is a high risk that I think needs to be tested constantly, or I just have that sort of, you know, that feeling you have in your stomach as a tester that's just sort of, this ain't right, but I don't know what's right, what it is specifically. So following those sort of, that analysis of myself and my intent in what I'm trying to do in my testing, I can then think about specific risks. So if I know what I want to check, if I know specifically what features I'm interested in finding information about, and if I want to know specific risks about those features, I can think about things like time-based. So I'm thinking, well, actually, I'm worried about this feature in terms of a sort of performance or load or stress context. Then we talk about automated regression checking. Notice how this sort of sits in a sort of map of other different activities and other different tools. Automated regression checking isn't the big thing, and then there's other bits around. It's just another means to sort of extend my testing. Regression, for me, is about regression checking or regression testing is about understanding the differences in change of quality as new things are introduced. So I can think about, well, I can think about the whole product, or I can think about individual parts of the product. And I can think about what interface can I use to learn about that part of that product and that specific risk. So I can think of API interfaces, network interfaces, visual, domain stuff, so contact-driven, consumer-driven contracts and that sort of thing. Again, sort of the focus being on how is this going to help me? Because this stuff is going to show me indicators that something's changed, and then I'm going to do something about it. And I had an interesting conversation with Eddie Brun. We were talking about like monitoring and actually how monitoring can be sort of context sensitive and it can't be. So we've got monitoring appearing in two different places because we can use monitoring to sort of hook it into like API health checks, or we can change our code so we've got specific values coming through it to monitor how users are using our application. But if I don't know what I want to check, I just want to sort of find some information out so that if something breaks, I can quickly, rapidly do something about it. Then I could use monitoring in a sort of contextless sort of situation. Just point it at that thing and just absorb as much traffic as possible and render it in pretty graphics so I could do something about it. And there are all sorts of different ways of doing this. So logging and proxies kind of sort of fit under monitoring. And validators don't know about your product, but they might have some specific set of rules that you need to compare what you've got against. So HTML, CSS validators, XML, JSON. Next, I find myself asking, I spend a lot of time configuring my product. Problem first. What is taking me so long? Well, it might be I'm configuring data, or I'm configuring a test environment. Well, what type of data am I configuring? Well, actually, I've just got to keep on creating lots of different types of data, and it's really boring. I'm typing it into an Excel sheet. Maybe I want to use a data randomizer. Maybe I want to use something, again, like Bug Magnet or Perl Clip. What if I'm just having to fill in this massive user interface, graphic GUI interface? And I just need to fill all these fields in because I'm just testing one field at the bottom. I could do Chrome extensions to form fill things. I could use JavaScript code snippets to inject values into them so that I can just quickly fill them in and then get on with my testing. Over the last few days, myself and a few other people, we've been pairing and mobbing together, and we're creating a custom third-party API. So I can make a call to it, and then it injects SQL into a database to create my data for me. And then I can hook up that API, that third-party API that sort of sits outside of my product, to something like Slack or Skype, so that we can just type, create me 6 users, and you have 6 users. Or it might be just something as simple as database statements, having SQL statements saved in a text file and just copying them across. I imagine that some of what I'm saying here, some of you might feel, oh, I do a little bit of that. I do a little bit about that. Keep doing that, but be analytical about why you're doing that. Think about it. See what the patterns are in your behavior and maybe see if you can try to sort of do that in other areas and see what sort of outcomes you get. And then configuring test environments. I'm stuck building environments, so I might want to use virtualization or tools like Docker, Ansible, Vagrant. Cool. And all those sort of things. I might want to use those as a means to create various, like to set up my environment quite easily. Or it's just a case of, every time I turn this application on, I have to reconfigure it and do all the admin stuff. If I could seed my database so that when it turns on, all those configuration things are just in there. And again, you could just do something simple. You could just have some shell scripts that just do all those commands that you have to do, that you're stuck doing every day. And then finally, this is my favorite one. I want to execute complex test ideas. So I'm in an exploratory testing context. I've done some testing. I'm like, I feel this is good. I've done some of the sort of obvious things, but now I want to really get into the nitty-gritty. I want to really find some interesting stuff. How do I do that if it's just me with a keyboard and a mouse? So, for example, we talked about sort of data-driven API stuff, sending many data sets. I might be like, well, I'm actually thinking about this in a sort of with a data model in mind. So I could use an API testing tool to drive lots of data. Or we could use fuzzing tools, mutation testing tools, property testing tools, all focusing around the same sort of risk, but working with it in different ways. Each of these tools works slightly differently to one another. So rather than just choosing one, I might want to choose all of them if I've got time. And then sort of my personal favorite is sort of manipulating GUIs in complex ways. One of my favorite bugs that I ever found was when I did in-browser JavaScript execution. I had a button. Well, we basically had this sort of administration panel where you had a tab, and you could click a plus sign, and it would create another tab. And I click a plus sign, and it create another tab. But what was really annoying was the tab kept moving the plus sign to the right. And I was getting really bored of just doing that. So I used my knowledge of JavaScript, and I worked out how to, in the console tab in Developer Tools, I worked out how to sort of basically locate that button. And then I did a for loop for 1,000 times. Crashed the browser. And it turned out there was a performance bug that every time you opened up this tab, it doubled the time it would take for the tab to load. So by the time I got to 100, we'd worked out it was going to take 6 hours for this tab to load. I couldn't have done that by myself. I'd have gone insane before I'd got to 100. I'd have given up at 5 seconds, probably. But using that, thinking about that problem, thinking about that risk, I could use a tool to help me identify that. So, in-browser JavaScript execution that I just then threw away. Little WebDriver scriptlets. I see people using things like Selenium IDE, not as a means to do regression checking, but as a means to just fill in data for them and work with a GUI so they can just press a button, go off and do something else, come back, and it's done for them. And then sort of things like chaos monkeys that I've seen like being sort of mentioned a bit. You know, the idea of just having a tool that just randomly clicks everywhere because it's going to approach it in a very different way to your own mindset. So those are sort of 3 examples of how my mindset of being critical of my tools, critical of myself, and thinking about how I'm strategizing my automation and how my tools are supporting me can work. So the benefits of this are that it empowers you to test rapidly. And I don't really want to say it makes you faster because there are, as we said, we looked at those sort of laws. There are things that it might make me faster in my testing, but it might slow me down in ways in which I have to maintain and understand these tools. But it does mean that, like some of the smaller things, it allows me to be agile about this sort of stuff. It supports your team as a whole. I've created tools that have like pulled values from databases and just put them in a nice like a nice view, and then found that actually the rest of the team have started using it because they find it massively valuable to understand where their data is traversing through systems. You know, it doesn't have to be just about tools to extend your testing. It could be tools to extend your team and your development. it's immensely satisfying. Like, I just told you that story of that JavaScript thing. I've told that story hundreds of times. I love telling that story. It's my favorite bug, and I got a real buzz from it when I did it. If you're an automator who's stuck, constantly fixing CSS selectors and messing around with page objects and swearing at Appium, think about this mindset. Think about taking a step away from that and trying a different tool, putting something together to help support someone else or support what you're doing in your testing. So to wrap up, automation should be used to augment our testing rather than replicate it. We should be critical of our tools, and we should be critical of ourselves as what we do as testers. There are many opportunities for automation in testing. We've looked at how we can do things from sort of the more sort of typical regression checking to sort of quite esoteric, sort of crazy JavaScript button pressing exercises. So be a tester and a toolsmith. And that's it. So all that's left for me to say is thank you and any questions. Cheers. Oh, it's cold. Okay, yeah, so any questions? Is there any sort of microphone or something? I can't. Do you want to? Thank you.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your talk. You talked about the tool selections that you made. Do you do that for every product, or do you have a specific set of tools that you use in every product that you have? Because in terms of maintainability and knowledge transfer to other testers, for example.
Okay, so we're sort of talking about sort of personal toolkits and maybe identifying things that could go in my toolkits?
No, I was thinking about if you select a tool for every product that you do. If you select a different tool, then you might have a problem keeping it up with maintainability. If you have to know every tool.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So that comes back to what we're talking about, that laws of media thing, is that obviously every tool that I create, whilst that might sort of create a collage, it does mean you end up in a sort of spinning plates situation. Some of the stuff that I'm talking about is very, like I say, it's very disposable. So it's not stuff, so some of these tools I'll use aren't things that I've programmed myself. I will have just picked them off the shelf or use an open source version of something. I find myself using Postman, for example, quite a lot in very different contexts. But I'm not responsible for maintaining that tool, and I'm not using that in an automated regression checking capacity, so it can actually be sort of quite disposable. So there's an element that some of this is kind of used in the moment, and then it's disposed of. With the regression checking side, you're absolutely right that there is a level of maintenance in terms of having all these different types of tools in place. I have the attitude that automation should be owned by the team. It shouldn't be owned by the testers. It should be owned by the team. So as a tester, I will probably inform the risks and talk about what this tool might help us learn more about this risk. But it may be that I'm not the one who's actually automating it. One of the biggest and most useful tools I found when it comes to sort of building regression checking is pairing. Pairing and mobbing is so valuable when it comes to that sort of approach, because you're sharing that information with other people, and also you're allowing other people to sort of get involved and help contribute towards it. Also, so cool. Oh, hello.
Hi, Mark.
Hello.
How are you doing? I'm well. Great talk. Thank you very much. My question is around getting buy-in and getting adequate time to build the adequate tooling or influence the architecture enough in terms of maybe something like testability to allow you to do your job better. How do you deal with those kinds of challenges. You know, because there's always another feature to get out, or there's something to improve or to work on. So how do you justify spending a number of days writing some kind of tool or automation or something like that?
So again, how do I influence my team? How do I convince them to take these approaches? So again, I would go back to the pairing and mobbing situation. Is that a lot of the things that I've learned in terms of programming and automation has been through pairing with developers. So whilst I have these like little throwaway things that I use, so things like, for example, like learning about consumer-driven contracts. And API testing. I learned that all by pairing with developers and asking them questions about it. We were actually developing features, but we were also coming up with the tools about it. I think that sort of goes into a wider thing of if you've got a good relationship with a developer and you're pairing, then the ideas, the suggestions, the questions that you're offering during that pairing session will help increase the testability. I do love working with teams that do TDD. If I can work with a developer who's quite mature with TDD, that makes things a lot easier. So when I come into a team, the first couple of things I tend to sort of do when people sort of come in and go, Mark, we need you to fix our automation. I go, brilliant, right, let's do TDD and exploratory testing. And they go, huh, what? But tools and stuff. Because it's about getting that communication and collaboration up and running before starting to charge into the tools. Understand your problems, understand your context first, then go into those sort of things. Excellent. Cool, I think that's it. So thank you, and if you want to come grab me, feel free.